Our topic is going to be the Mosin Nagant rifles and carbines manufactured in the Soviet Union and imported into the United States. In particular, we are going to talk about the problem that many of these guns have in which the bolt fails to work smoothly. This appears to be most common among the guns that were produced during World War II. We're going to look at what causes this problem and how to fix it. One thing that we're not going to do here is tell you that you have to do an entire list of things to repair a sticky Mosin bolt. And there is a reason for that. That reason is that we can give you more help by describing the different factors that can cause the problem and then describing the symptoms of each one of these factors to you. If a Mosin bolt fails to operate smoothly, there will be some clues that will give us evidence of why this is happening. We are going to look at these less obvious pieces of evidence because, as we will see, they can pinpoint precisely why the problem or problems are occurring. By doing this, we can help you diagnose what's happening to your gun if you have a problem. It's important to remember that even though there are a number of things that can make a Mosin bolt fail to work smoothly, it only takes one of them to create a problem. We also should consider that if you take a Mosin to a gunsmith, who in turn works on every possible cause of a sticky bolt, that's going to increase your expenses on a gun that only costs about $100 to begin with. So it will be more economical to fix only what needs to be fixed. We'll talk about a number of other things, but we'll run through all the sticky bolt stuff first. Our demonstrator gun will be this 9130 rifle that I own. It was made in 1943. This gun had a number of good things about it when I bought it, and we'll talk about those later. And it also had a problem. This problem. Ultimately, I repaired that problem, and now the gun runs like this. This gun is a good case study for our purposes because I'm quite sure its problems were considerably more severe than what one is going to find in the typical World War II Mosin Nagant. But once its problems were identified, it was only a matter of time until I took care of them, and the result was a vast improvement. The biggest problem with this gun is that when one tried to load a round into the chamber from the magazine, the face of the bolt would not effectively and reliably engage the rim of the cartridge. The bolt face has an opening into which the cartridge base fits, and the problem was that the inside of this opening on its leading edge was far too sharp. The inside lip of that opening was a very sharp right angle, so sharp that if you tried to load a round from the magazine, at least 50% of the time it would snag on the cartridge base. The bolt would lock up and absolutely refuse to move. There were 3 different symptoms that identified that this is what the problem was. The first symptom is that if I loaded the rounds one at a time directly into the chamber, the bolt would quite easily close and fully engage the cartridge. This happened because when the cartridge was already in the chamber, it was perfectly lined up with the bolt. By comparison, the round coming out of the magazine is moving at an angle, and the tolerance on the end of the bolt has to be a little on the loose side to completely grab the round. The next symptom could be seen when the bolt froze and refused to load a cartridge. If I removed that cartridge after this happened, I could see damage on the cartridge base caused by the bolt face cutting into the metal. Here we're looking at the base of 2 cartridges that had this experience. If you look at the bottom of each one in this photo, you can see a light reflecting off of what is a burr. This burr was cut into the cartridge bases by the bolt face. The third symptom is that the bolt face would often shear metal off the very edge of the cartridge rim. If we look at this photo, we can see a steel splinter on the side of the cartridge rim. That metal was sheared off by the sharp edge on the opening of the bolt face. This photograph shows the end of the bolt in its original condition. If you look in particular in the area inside the little black box I have drawn, you will see that the top of the edge on the bolt face opening is very flat, and this is what created that very sharp right angle on the edge of the inside that was hanging up on the metal of the cartridge bases. Here is the end of the bolt after I did the repair. Again, if you look inside the black box I have drawn, you will see that now the interior of that bolt face opening has been rounded slightly. Now the cartridge bays can slide in, friction has been eliminated, the snagging has been eliminated. The tools I used for this job were a very, very tiny little half-round file that I have. I basically slid it around the inside of that opening with a circular motion, taking care to avoid the extractor. And I followed it up with 220 grit sandpaper and very fine steel wool. I hope it's obvious why I would never use a power tool for a job like this. This is the kind of thing that you want to get just right. Additionally, when doing work like this, I think it's important to creep up on your goal. Work slowly for a little while, test it, see if it works. If you need to take more metal off, do a little at a time. Test it again. Your goal is to get to the point where the thing will work reliably, and then you stop removing metal. At the risk of sounding like a nag, again, I urge you to move slowly when you do any kind of work like this. Once the thing has been fixed and the gun has been taken care of and is working great, whatever time it took to get the job done right was time well spent. Also, when you do work like this, you're going to have little tiny bits of metal and sandpaper and steel wool that are going to end up all over the place. It's important that you clean all that up. One thing that's good for this is to get a can of compressed air, the kind of stuff that people use to clean the inside of their computers. Take it outside and blow all that stuff off. You don't want any of it left on the gun components. A common complaint with these guns is the bolt will not open easily after the gun has been fired. One thing that's frequently cited as a cause of this problem is when the spring that operates the firing pin is too stiff. What we're looking at here is an M44 Mosin Nagant that I once owned, and indeed with this gun the spring was in fact too stiff. There's a pretty easy way to diagnose if this is the case. Basically what you do is with an empty gun, dry fire it, and then open the bolt. If the bolt is quite stiff after you dry fire the empty gun, I would take that as clear evidence that the spring is involved. If, on the other hand, we dry fire the gun and the bolt opens nearly as easy as it did otherwise, I would say that there's no problem with the spring. As a point of clarity here, even if the spring is too stiff and you close and open the bolt without pulling the trigger, you'll probably find the thing will open quite easily. It's when the firing pin is forward that the trouble takes place. Let me say that there is an alternative to dry firing the gun. Basically what you do when the gun is empty is you push the bolt forward, you depress the trigger, and then you close the bolt. When you do this, the firing pin will move forward without the violence of a dry firing motion. And if you want to check a Mosin out in a gun store and not attract any attention, this is probably the best way to do it. Again, make sure the gun is empty if you do this testing. Stick your finger in the chamber if you have to and make sure there's no round in there. I know we all want to be as safe as possible. If in fact you have a firing pin spring that is too strong, I cannot speak with authority on how to repair this because it's a job I have not done. With that M44, I made a decision to sell the gun. With my 9130, the spring is not a problem. I can only refer you to other online sources, or perhaps even better, a gunsmith. Another thing that is discussed a great deal is cosmoline. Cosmoline is a yellow, waxy lubricant the Soviets used on their guns in long-term storage. There are two types of cosmoline. One is the type that is not yet dried out, and the other is the type that has dried out. The stuff that has not yet dried out is pretty easy to deal with. The stuff that has dried out is often as dry as a bone and can cause a little more trouble. The cosmoline that has not yet dried out is often quite easy to see. One thing that's good about it is it will liquefy when it gets hot. For example, if we take the gun to the range and fire it 5 or 6 times in fairly rapid succession, any cosmoline that is not dried out will liquefy and start running all over the place. When I first fired this gun, it poured like bacon grease out from beneath the rear sight. When I went to the range, I took a chamber brush and a rod and some patches. I brushed and wiped out the chamber repeatedly. It's also possible to use degreasers and other sort of washing techniques to remove cosmoline that is not yet dried out, and that's effective also. If you suspect you are dealing with cosmoline that has dried out, probably the best place to start is with a penetrating oil such as WD-40. Let it soak a while and clean it all out. I did that with my rifle. but even afterward I still felt like there was still something in the chamber. Basically, the situation was I would run a chamber brush inside the gun and I felt like I was encountering friction. I did not encounter this when I ran the brush through other surplus rifles, and I wasn't sure if cosmoline was a factor or not. One thing that's true about this gun is there are many tool marks all over the place. They didn't polish the thing up very well in the factory, and this made me wonder if the chamber was not as smooth inside as it should be. Regardless, I decided I need to polish the inside of the chamber. To accomplish this, I wrapped 220 grit sandpaper around a cleaning rod, and I slid it in the chamber, and I ran the thing back and forth, side to side, making sure I was hitting all the surfaces. Then I followed up with a 45 caliber brush that was wrapped in very fine steel wool. I repeated this process a few times, and then the chamber brush seemed to be going in and out without any friction. And also, when I went to the range, the bolt would open easier after I fired the gun each time. I'm not sure that this gun doesn't need some more of this treatment later on. What I did inside the chamber was actually very gentle. It does take some pretty serious abrasion to even remove 1/1000th of an inch from steel this hard. What I was doing was nowhere near that serious. I want to fire the gun another 100 times before I decide if I'm finished with this. I have to buy the ammo, of course, and that's money. We don't call this flat-broke gunner for nothing, let me tell you. Every Mosin bolt I have examined has been very smooth and polished on the outside where it engages with the receiver. I suppose it's possible to encounter something different, like a bolt that makes grinding noises when it slides back and forth in the receiver. If I encountered that, I would polish the outside of the bolt with light sandpaper and light steel wool. For whatever reason, the type of ammunition used is a factor in how smoothly the bolt operates on my gun. Here we are looking at 2 surplus rounds for the Mosin, manufactured in the former communist bloc. The caliber, of course, is 7.62 by 54R. According to online sources I have seen, the round on the left was manufactured in the former Soviet Union, and the round on the right was manufactured in the former Czechoslovakia. What we're looking at here is a fired casing of the Czech ammo, and as you can see, there's a rather large split in the shoulder. When I use this ammunition, about half of it at least will split to some degree in that location. Not all of the damage to the case is severe as what we see here, but much of it is. By comparison, I fired quite a bit of the Soviet ammunition, and it never does this. My digital caliper shows me that such a damaged Czech case can at the shoulder be several thousandths of an inch larger in diameter than a comparable fired Soviet case. This means the fired Czech case can be tighter in the chamber than the fired Soviet case, and if that happens, the bolt will be harder to open. There's every reason to suspect that many Mosin rifles will fire tons of Czech ammo and never have a split case, but at least in the case of my gun, the wisest thing to do is stick to the Soviet ammunition. I should point out, with the Czech ammunition that does split, there are no other problems involved. There are no gas leaks, and the ammunition is accurate. The next item is the extractor. What we're looking at here is the extractor on my gun soon after I purchased it. You'll notice that the very leading edge of the extractor comes to a rather sharp point or ridge. The same thing is happening with the hook that grasps the cartridge rim. On some of the smoother Mosins I have seen, the extractor looks a little different. The very leading point of the extractor has a small flat spot, and there's also a small flattened area on the hook that grabs the cartridge rim. As I said, I had issues with the bolt on my gun closing when I chambered around, so I decided to add those small flat spots. The thinking being the flat spots were put there to prevent the extractor from excessively digging into the cartridge. To remove the extractor, one has to remove the very front of the bolt, and I'll show you later how to do that. And then one has to tap the extractor out of the front of the bolt. As I was working on this procedure, I received a very unpleasant surprise. At the base of the extractor, I could see that one corner of the extractor had somehow become fused to the bolt. I hope you can see it okay. Inside this small black box shows where the outline of the extractor disappears, where the two pieces of metal somehow merge. Whether this was done on purpose or accidentally, I have no idea, but I do know that one is supposed to be able to tap the extractor out of the bolt with relative ease, and this was preventing it from happening. After pondering this problem for a while, I decided to take a very, very, very small drill bit and score that area to see if I could break that thing loose to get the two pieces to separate. Ultimately, I did. It was then I discovered that the extractor itself was warped. And by that I mean it had a slight propeller twist to it. This meant that it was not grabbing the cartridge rim with an equal amount of pressure on both sides of the extractor. If the extractor is slightly twisted like this, it means that it cannot flex as easily as it would have were it perfectly straight. Now, by word of additional explanation, the extractor in the Mosin is not like you will see in many other guns. There is no apparatus beneath it. There is no little spring hidden beneath it. Instead, the extractor itself is a piece of spring steel, and there's one spot along its length where it has been thinned a bit, and that's where most of the flex happens. I'd like to be able to tell you that a warped extractor is something that is very rare, but I have seen a Mosin in a store that had an extractor warped even worse than mine. It was very easy to spot simply looking at the end of the bolt. The thing was not sitting in its slot evenly. One long edge was twisted in toward the bolt, and the other long edge was slightly twisted out. It is entirely possible, I suppose, that on that particular gun, the twisted extractor might not have caused any problem at all. But had I been shopping for a gun and spotted that, I think I would have passed that particular one up and moved on to look at other ones. To create those flat spots I pointed out earlier, what I used was a simple whetstone on the end and a bit of 220 sandpaper wrapped around a small screwdriver shaft on the hook part. This shot shows what the inside of the extractor looked like soon after I bought the gun. You can see there are very heavy tool marks there. What I did was I basically smoothed those tool marks off until it was pretty much flat. My digital caliper showed it to be 36 thousandths of an inch at the thinnest spot. I decided to thin the extractor so it would flex a little easier, and I took it down to 33 thousandths of an inch. This is what it looked like when I was finished. You can see there's a quite long, smooth spot on the inside of the extractor. It was important that I not focus my work simply on the thinnest part of the extractor because that would have created excessive flex, possibly metal fatigue, and possibly broken the extractor. On the other hand, if we take the metal down over a longer area, we'll create a taper that will distribute the stress when it flexes, and the result will be a more durable extractor. Now, I have to confess, in the interests of full disclosure, that I did the work on this extractor before I discovered the problem with the bolt face. The bolt face problem was so severe that I wonder if I even really needed to work on the extractor. In retrospect, I would have worked on the bolt face first, and if in fact the extractor needed to be modified, that would have been the following step. Another item frequently discussed with the Mosin is the head space. Now on this particular rifle I have the serial numbers on the bolt and the receiver do match. This has always been a clue to me in the past with a surplus gun that there's no issue with the head space. However, with the M44 I had, the bolt and the receiver did not have matching numbers, and I was a little concerned about the head space. There are a number of online sources that discuss Mosin headspace with a note of seriousness and urgency about them, yet I have never been able to encounter a person face-to-face who gave headspace a second thought. I bought the M44 mainly as a war relic, and I was a little concerned about it, and I asked the sales guy, is this thing okay to shoot? And he said, oh, these guns shoot great. And I said, I'm sorry, I meant the headspace. Is that okay? And he looked at me like I did not know what I was talking about. Eventually, I took the M44 to a gunsmith and asked him if it was in fact okay to shoot. Was it safe? Would he check it out? He gave it a chemical bath that cleaned the metal up quite a bit. He told me he improved things by filing a little spot here and filing a little spot there. And then he loaded the gun and fired it. He did not check the headspace. Checking the headspace requires gauges that tend to be a little expensive, and I personally don't know anyone who owns them. The M44 probably was imported into the United States back in 2005 or 6. The guns that are imported more recently have been refurbished and gone over and come with a number of accessories. With those guns, I'm quite confident that you're always going to find one on which the bolt numbers and the receiver numbers do match. And if you do have any doubt, talk to the salespeople in the store that are selling the gun. The main worry about headspace, if you're not familiar with the term, is the possibility that an ill-fitting bolt could send gas outside the receiver, outside of the action when the gun is fired, and that gas possibly could injure the shooter. One thing you might encounter is a Mosin that has a magazine spring that does not want to push the top round up far enough. If you do encounter that, it's pretty easy to fix. If you look here at the bottom of the magazine, you will see a little switch. You push that switch and tug on the bottom of the magazine, and you can remove the magazine spring assembly. That assembly works sort of like a pair of pliers, and if you give it a pinch, you can pull it off of the pin that holds it into the magazine. This photo shows the pliers-like end of the assembly. The pencil is pointing to a particular spot, which if you file it down lightly or sand it down, it will increase the tension on the spring, and it will push the magazine follower up higher with more pressure than it would otherwise. If you take too much metal off there, it will create the effect of pushing the follower up higher than normal, and you won't be able to close the bolt on an empty chamber without depressing that follower a little bit. This would create the effect of having a hold-open device like you might find on a Mauser, for example. It really would not do any harm, however, you might not like it if it happens to your Mosin. One word of warning: if you remove the top round from the magazine and the round below doesn't seem to want to come up, do not immediately assume the magazine spring is the problem. The magazine contains a device called the interrupter, and it is designed to hold down the second round from the top while the round above it is moving in and out of the action. The interrupter might be holding that second round down. A reliable test of your magazine spring is to work with one round only. If you put one round in and that round is not being pushed up high enough, probably the spring is the problem. I earlier mentioned that my 9130 rifle had some good things about it when I bought it. Let's talk about those for a second. One of the things that impressed me was the bore in this barrel looked like it was brand new. They were making millions of these things during World War II. As time went on, the Soviet Army began to rely more and more on automatic weapons. That probably has something to do with the fact that this gun was manufactured and apparently never used to any extent whatsoever. During an earlier video, I complained about the trigger on the M44 that I owned. That trigger would move a long distance before the gun would fire, and I could never quite memorize where that particular spot was. And then one day I met a fellow at the range who was shooting this, a Mosin sniper model whose components were all manufactured during the Soviet era. He let me shoot this gun a couple of times, and it shot like a dream, and the trigger was fantastic. And I asked him a lot of questions, and he said he did a lot of work on the gun. Not long after, I resolved that, yes, indeed, a Mosin could have a great trigger, and I decided to swap out the M44 for a 9130. The rifle I ended up with has a trigger that is virtually as good as that on the sniper gun with no modifications made to it. These good Mosin triggers I am describing are quite similar to a two-stage trigger, but they're not exactly the same. With a normal two-stage trigger, there is an amount of free play early in the trigger pull called the take-up. Then abruptly the trigger becomes stiff in one particular spot. Pull it past that spot and it fires. The Mosin doesn't duplicate that precisely. Instead, there is a loose early stage of the take-up, and then it gets stiff somewhat softly. There is no abrupt stiffening. It's rather a gradual one. But once you know where that spot is, you can control the trigger pull with reasonable effectiveness. Here is a target of me shooting my gun at 50 yards. One thing I had to do was spend quite a bit of time adjusting the sight. I never quite got it exactly right for 100 yards, but I did know where it was hitting, and I was able to compensate by holding over a little bit, and I shot this target at 100 yards. 4 of my 5 shots hit an 8.5 by 11 piece of typewriting paper. That's about the best I'm going to do with this gun until I get the sight straightened up. The only way to adjust the windage is to tap the front sight back and forth in its dovetail, I'm going to have to spend more time on it before I get it completely squared away. I earlier described the Soviet and Czechoslovakian ammunition. It might be worthwhile if you know what the packages look like. The Czech ammo on the left comes in a gray rectangular box. The Soviet ammo comes wrapped in paper that is tied with string. I really love the fact it's tied with string. This is the packaging of the communist paradise. It is true that untold millions of rounds from the former communist bloc have been imported into the United States, and we're shooting the stuff up at a very healthy clip. At the range I go to, there are spent Mosin casings everywhere on the ground. At some point in the future, we're going to shoot all this stuff up and it'll be gone. However, I'm quite confident that when that happens, the armory at Tula will step in and start manufacturing the stuff in considerable volume. And they make pretty decent ammo at a decent price. I think they'll take care of us. Earlier, I promised to show you how to take the front of the bolt off. The first step is to move the bolt from the cocked to uncocked position with a twist. We move this piece over a little bit, pull the front off, give it a twist, and it comes off. To reassemble the bolt, there's a small lug here that goes in this groove. Put it in, twist it. This open end here goes on another lug back here. Slide it on. Give it a little push over to line it up. Snap it closed. Recock the bolt. This photo shows the front of the bolt with the extractor removed. If you note the area the pencil is pointing to, it's a bit wider than the rest of the groove. That's where the widest part of the extractor fits. You insert the extractor into the bolt from this side. To remove the extractor, you have to tap it on the opposite side with a hammer. I found that a brass hammer will work well. A plastic hammer will not work at all. I was afraid to use a steel hammer for fear of damaging the extractor. To remove the extractor, I tightened the bolt into a small vise that had been padded with leather. I used the hammer to tap the top of the extractor down flush with the face of the bolt. Then I flattened an empty 223 casing. I put that on the top of the extractor like a punch, tap that with a hammer, and use that to knock the extractor out completely. If you've never encountered a Mosin before, one thing about them that is a little different is they do not have a traditional safety. The only thing that approximates the safety is pulling the cocking handle back, twisting it to the left, and catching it on the edge of the receiver. This was almost impossible to do with my M44 because, as I said, it did have an exceptionally strong firing pin spring. With the 9130, switching back and forth from the safe to the fire position is not something that can be done terribly quickly, but it can be done. By the way, the History Channel pronounces it Mosin Nagant, and I'm sure if I tried to pronounce it that way all the time, I'd screw it up eventually, so I just called it Mosin. I could keep talking about these guns at great length, but I think it's time to wrap it up. The main thing is to get them working correctly, and when they are working correctly, what's not to love?